Have you ever attended a dinner party where the silence was more deafening than any scream? Where the clinking of silverware could mask a secret that would curdle your blood? Tonight, we delve into such a tale. A story of opulence, betrayal, and a guest who never left. But before we pull back the curtain on this chilling affair, do me a solid and hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell too, so you never miss another journey into the shadows. You wouldn't want to be left out in the cold, would you? Now, pour yourself a drink, dim the lights, and prepare for the last guest. A dinner that ended in silence. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, nestled amongst the usual dreary assortment of bills and junk mail. It was an anomaly of elegance. A thick, cream-colored cardstock with a deckled edge. The calligraphy a swirling, ostentatious display of black ink. It smelled faintly of vanilla and old paper, a scent that immediately transported Eleanor Vance back to her grandmother's attic, a place of forgotten treasures and whispered secrets. The host was a name she hadn't heard in years, Julian Croft, a name that conjured images of sun-drenched vineyards in Tuscany, of boisterous laughter echoing across a candlelit table, of a man who lived life as if it were a grand, unending feast. Julian had been a peripheral figure in her late husband's life, a charismatic but enigmatic business associate who had vanished from their social circle as abruptly as he had appeared. The invitation was for a dinner party at his secluded estate, Blackwood Manor, a place rumored to be as steeped in history as it was in shadow. The date was set for the following Saturday, a mere 4 days away. A strange sense of unease prickled at Eleanor's skin, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It had been 2 years since her husband, Richard, had passed, and the silence in their once vibrant home had become a suffocating presence. The thought of a lavish dinner party, of being surrounded by the glitterati of the city, was both daunting and, if she were honest with herself, a little thrilling. She traced the embossed crest at the top of the invitation, a stylized raven with a key in its beak. It was a detail that felt both theatrical and foreboding. Against her better judgment, a flicker of curiosity ignited within her. Perhaps this was what she needed, a jolt out of her monotonous grief, a return to the world of the living. With a sigh that was equal parts trepidation and anticipation, she penned her acceptance. The drive to Blackwood Manor was a journey into another world. The city's familiar grid of streets gave way to winding country lanes, the air growing crisp and clean with the scent of pine and damp earth. As the sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road, the manor came into view. It was a Gothic masterpiece of stone and slate, its turrets and gables silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. A murder of crows circled one of the chimneys, their cause a discordant welcome. A uniformed valet, his face as impassive as the stone gargoyles that adorned the entrance, took her car keys. As she stepped out, a gust of wind whipped her silk scarf around her neck, and she shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The heavy oak door swung open before she could reach for the ornate knocker, revealing a man who could only be Julian Croft. He was just as she remembered him, though perhaps a little more weathered by time. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held a familiar, mischievous glint. He was dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. "Eleanor, my dear," he boomed, his voice a rich baritone that filled the cavernous foyer. "You look as radiant as ever. I'm so glad you could make it." He took her hand, his touch surprisingly warm, and led her inside. The interior of Blackwood Manor was as grand and imposing as its exterior. A sweeping staircase dominated the foyer, its banister carved with a procession of mythical beasts. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, its flames casting dancing shadows on the tapestries that lined the walls. The other guests had already arrived, a motley crew of the city's elite. There was a celebrated actress, her laughter a little too loud, her jewels a little too bright. A stern-faced banker, his eyes constantly darting around the room as if assessing the value of every antique. A young, brooding artist, his silence as conspicuous as the actress's noise. A well-known politician, his smile as polished and insincere as his campaign promises. And a mousy woman who seemed to be a permanent fixture at the politician's side, her presence almost ghost-like. Julian, ever the consummate host, moved through the room with an easy grace, his charm a potent elixir that seemed to put everyone at ease. He introduced Eleanor to the other guests, his anecdotes and witty remarks weaving a tapestry of shared history and intrigue. As the champagne flowed and the canapés were passed, a fragile camaraderie began to form amongst the disparate group. Yet, beneath the veneer of conviviality, Eleanor sensed an undercurrent of tension. The smiles didn't quite reach the eyes. The laughter had a brittle edge. Each guest seemed to be playing a part, their public personas a carefully constructed shield against some unspoken truth. Dinner was announced, and they were ushered into a dining room that was a study in Gothic opulence. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, was set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses. A magnificent chandelier, its crystals dripping like frozen tears, cast a warm, golden glow over the room. Eleanor found herself seated between the brooding artist, who introduced himself as Liam, and the banker, whose name was Mr. Abernathy. Across the table, the actress, Beatrice, was holding court, her voice a theatrical purr as she recounted an amusing anecdote from her latest film set. The first course was served, a delicate consommé with a single, perfect quenelle of truffle-infused cream. As they ate, Julian, seated at the head of the table, raised his glass. "To old friends and new," he said, his eyes sweeping over his guests. "And to an evening of unforgettable revelations." A toast was murmured, but the words seemed to hang in the air, imbued with a weight that was both intriguing and unsettling. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed, a meandering river of gossip, politics, and art. Yet, with each course, with each new bottle of wine that was opened, the undercurrent of tension seemed to swell. Old rivalries resurfaced, veiled insults were exchanged, and a palpable sense of unease began to permeate the room. Eleanor, a keen observer of human nature, noticed the subtle shifts in a way that the others, lost in their own self-importance, seemed to miss. The way Abernathy's hand tightened on his wine glass when the politician, Mr. Davies, spoke of financial regulations. The way Beatrice's smile faltered for a moment when Liam mentioned a particularly scathing review of her last performance. The way Julian seemed to be orchestrating the entire evening, his questions and comments like a conductor's baton, guiding the symphony of discord. The main course arrived, a magnificent roast pheasant with all the trimmings. It was a dish fit for a king, yet the atmosphere in the room had become so thick with unspoken animosity that the food seemed to turn to ash in Eleanor's mouth. It was during a lull in the conversation, a moment of silence that was more pregnant than any spoken word, that Julian spoke again. His voice, once a warm and welcoming embrace, had taken on a chillingly precise tone. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I've brought you here tonight," he said, his eyes locking with each of his guests in turn. "The truth is, we are all connected, not just by the flimsy threads of social acquaintance, but by a secret that has lain dormant for far too long." A hush fell over the room, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. The air crackled with a sudden electric tension. The pretense of a convivial dinner party had been stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly truth that lay beneath. Julian then proceeded to unravel a tale of betrayal, greed, and a crime that had been committed years ago. A business deal gone wrong, a fortune stolen, a life ruined. And at the center of it all was a man who was not present at the table, a man named Marcus Thorne. As Julian spoke, Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She remembered Marcus Thorne. He had been another of Richard's business associates, a man whose ambition had always been a little too sharp, his smile a little too predatory. He had disappeared around the same time as Julian, and rumors had swirled about his sudden departure, whispers of financial ruin and a hurried flight from the country. But the story Julian told was far darker than any of the rumors. He spoke of a conspiracy, of a group of people who had conspired to ruin Marcus Thorne, to steal his invention, a revolutionary piece of technology that would have changed the world. And as he spoke, his gaze lingered on each of his guests, a silent accusation in his eyes. The banker, Abernathy, had been Thorne's financial advisor, the one who had cooked the books and facilitated the theft. The politician, Davies, had used his influence to bury the investigation, to ensure that Thorne had no legal recourse. The actress, Beatrice, had been Thorne's lover, the one who had betrayed his trust, who had provided the conspirators with the information they needed to destroy him. And the artist, Liam, had been a young, impressionable protege of Thorne's, the one who had been manipulated into stealing his mentor's research. A wave of denials and recriminations swept through the room. Abernathy's face was a mask of indignant rage. Davies sputtered, his polished facade cracking under the pressure. Beatrice's theatrical composure crumbled, revealing a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. And Liam, the brooding artist, simply stared at his plate, his silence a confession in itself. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been brought here under false pretenses, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. She looked at Julian, his face a chillingly calm mask, and she saw the madness in his eyes. This was not a dinner party. It was a trial. And Julian had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. The mousy woman at the politician's side, who had been silent all evening, suddenly let out a small, strangled sob. All eyes turned to her. She was a ghost at the feast, a forgotten player in this twisted drama. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with terror. I was Marcus Thorne's assistant," she stammered. "I knew what they were doing. I tried to warn him, but I was too afraid." Julian smiled, a cold, reptilian smile that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "And that, my dear, is why you are here tonight, to bear witness, to see that justice is finally served." He then revealed the final, horrifying piece of his plan. Marcus Thorne, he explained, had not disappeared. He had been driven to despair, to a place from which there was no return. And tonight, on the anniversary of his death, his betrayers would finally face their reckoning. The doors to the dining room slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, deafening silence. The candlelight flickered, casting long, menacing shadows on the walls. The feast had ended. The trial had begun. And Eleanor Vance, an unwilling guest at this banquet of an unfolding nightmare, realized with a sickening certainty that the last guest at this dinner party might not be leaving at all. The immediate aftermath of Julian's revelation was a maelstrom of chaos. Abernathy, his face a blotchy canvas of crimson and white, leaped to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the polished floor. "This is madness, Croft. Utter madness. You can't keep us here," he bellowed, his voice a tremor of fury and fear. He lunged for the door, his portly frame surprisingly agile, but the heavy oak remained stubbornly, unervingly shut. He rattled the ornate handle, his grunts of exertion a stark counterpoint to the chilling silence that had once again descended upon the room. Beatrice, her carefully constructed composure shattered, had dissolved into a series of theatrical sobs, her mascara tracing dark rivulets down her porcelain cheeks. "I had nothing to do with it, I swear," she wailed, her voice a shrill, unconvincing plea. "Marcus was unstable. He was obsessed with his work. I left him for my own sanity." Davies, the politician, had adopted a posture of blustering indignation, his face a mask of practiced outrage. "This is a preposterous accusation, a slanderous attack on my character. I will not be held captive by a madman," he declared, his voice resonating with the hollow boom of a campaign speech. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian, who remained seated at the head of the table, a serene, almost beatific smile playing on his lips. Liam, the artist, had sunk deeper into his chair, his face pale and drawn. He seemed to be a man already defeated, a ghost at a feast of his own making. The mousy assistant, whose name they now knew was Clara, was a crumpled heap of misery, her quiet sobs a constant, mournful undertone to the escalating drama. Eleanor, however, felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The initial shock had given way to a chilling clarity. She was trapped, a pawn in a game of vengeance that had been years in the making. Panic would not serve her. She needed to think, to observe, to understand the intricate web of deceit that had been woven around her. Her gaze fell upon Julian, the architect of their shared nightmare. He seemed to be savoring the chaos, his eyes flitting from one panicked face to another, a connoisseur of despair. He was a man who had been consumed by a singular purpose, a man who had sacrificed his own humanity on the altar of revenge. "Please, my dear friends, do try to compose yourselves," Julian said, his voice a silken thread of menace that cut through the cacophony of a rising panic. "The evening is far from over, and I assure you, the doors will remain locked until we have reached a satisfactory conclusion." He then produced a small, ornate key from his pocket, the same key that was depicted in the raven crest on the invitation. He held it up for all to see, a tangible symbol of their imprisonment. "This," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is the only way out, and it will only be used when the truth has been fully acknowledged." With that, he rose from his chair and walked over to the fireplace, his movements as fluid and deliberate as a predator stalking its prey. He placed the key on the mantelpiece, a tantalizing promise of freedom that was just out of reach. The hours that followed were a grueling exercise in psychological warfare. Julian, with the skill of a seasoned interrogator, began to dismantle each of his guests' carefully constructed facades. He produced letters, financial records, and sworn affidavits, each piece of evidence a hammer blow against their desperate denials. He revealed how Abernathy had systematically siphoned funds from Thorne's accounts, leaving him on the brink of bankruptcy. He presented a secret recording of a conversation between Davies and a high-ranking police official, a conversation in which the politician had boasted about his ability to make Thorne's legal problems disappear. He read aloud a series of passionate, and ultimately treacherous, letters from Beatrice to one of her many lovers, letters in which she had mocked Thorne's ambition and revealed the intimate details of his research. And then he turned to Liam. He produced a series of sketches, early drafts of the very technology that had been stolen from Thorne. The sketches were in Liam's distinctive style, yet they were dated before Thorne had even approached him with the offer of a mentorship. It was a damning piece of evidence, a clear indication that Liam had been working with the conspirators from the very beginning. Liam, who had been a silent observer until now, finally broke. "I was young," he whispered, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. "I was desperate. They promised me everything. Fame, fortune, a place in the art world. I didn't know. I didn't understand what I was doing. You understood enough to betray the man who had taken you under his wing, who had treated you like a son," Julian countered, his voice devoid of any sympathy. As the night wore on, the once glamorous dining room became a pressure cooker of fear and suspicion. Alliances were formed and then just as quickly dissolved. Accusations were hurled back and forth, the air thick with the stench of desperation. The remnants of the feast, the half-eaten pheasant and the wilting flowers, served as a grotesque backdrop to the unfolding human drama. Eleanor, for the most part, remained silent, her mind a whirring engine of observation and deduction. She watched as the others turned on each other, their civility a thin veneer that had been stripped away to reveal the primal instincts that lay beneath. She saw the flicker of guilt in Abernathy's eyes, the cold, calculating ambition in Davies's, the pathetic self-pity in Beatrice's, and the profound, soul-crushing regret in Liam's. But it was Julian who intrigued her the most. He was a man possessed, a specter of vengeance who had orchestrated this entire macabre theater. Yet, as she watched him, she began to see the cracks in his own carefully constructed facade. She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes when he spoke of Marcus Thorne, a pain that went beyond a mere sense of injustice. She saw the tremor in his hand as he poured himself another glass of wine, a hand that was not as steady as he would have liked them to believe. A new suspicion began to form in her mind, a suspicion that was as chilling as it was audacious. What if Julian's story was not the whole truth? What if there was another layer to this intricate web of deceit, a layer that even he was not aware of? Her gaze was drawn to the mousy assistant, Clara. She had remained on the periphery of the drama, her presence almost forgotten in the whirlwind of accusations and denials. Yet, Eleanor had noticed something that the others, in their self-absorbed panic, had missed. She had noticed the way Clara's eyes had followed Julian, a look that was not one of fear, but of something else, something that looked disturbingly like adoration. It was a fleeting expression, a momentary lapse in her carefully constructed mask of terror, but it was enough to ignite a spark of suspicion in Eleanor's mind. She decided to take a gamble. During a lull in the recriminations, a moment when the exhaustion in the room was as palpable as the fear, she turned to Clara. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, a stark contrast to the histrionics that had filled the room for hours. "Clara," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "You said you were Marcus Thorne's assistant. You must have known him well." Clara looked up, her eyes wide and startled. Yes," she stammered. "I worked for him for 3 years." "He must have trusted you," Eleanor continued, her voice still gentle, yet insistent. "He must have confided in you." Clara nodded, a single jerky movement of her head. "He did," she whispered. "He told me everything." "Did he ever mention Julian?" Eleanor asked, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. "Did he ever speak of their friendship?" A strange expression flickered across Clara's face, a mixture of confusion and something else, something that looked almost like panic. They were business associates," she said, her voice barely audible. "That's all." But Eleanor was not convinced. She had seen the flicker of something more in Clara's eyes, a hint of a secret that was even darker than the one that Julian had so dramatically revealed. She decided to press her advantage. "Are you sure about that, Clara?" she asked, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Because I seem to recall my husband mentioning that Julian and Marcus were more than just business associates, that they were inseparable." The effect of her words was instantaneous. Clara's face, which had been a pale mask of fear, suddenly crumpled. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, and a torrent of words came pouring out of her, a confession that was as shocking as it was unexpected. It turned out that Clara had not been a mere assistant. She had been Marcus Thorne's secret lover, a woman who had been so consumed by her jealousy of his friendship with Julian that she had set in motion the very events that had led to his downfall. She had been the one who had leaked information to Abernathy, who had planted the seeds of doubt in Beatrice's mind, who had manipulated the young and impressionable Liam. She had done it all, she confessed through a torrent of sobs, because she had wanted Marcus all to herself. She had wanted to destroy the one person who she believed stood in the way of her happiness. Julian Croft. The revelation hung in the air, a bombshell that had just been dropped into the already volatile atmosphere of the room. The other guests stared at Clara in stunned silence, their own betrayals paling in comparison to the sheer, obsessive malevolence of her actions. But it was Julian's reaction that was the most telling. He stared at Clara, his face a mask of disbelief. The serene, almost smug expression he had worn all evening had been replaced by a look of utter, soul-crushing devastation. The man who had orchestrated this entire evening of vengeance, who had believed himself to be the master of his own carefully constructed narrative, had just discovered that he, too, had been a pawn in a much larger and much more twisted game. The silence in the room was finally and irrevocably broken. But it was not the silence of fear or suspicion. It was the silence of a truth that was far more terrible than any of them could have ever imagined. And in that silence, Eleanor Vance knew, with a chilling certainty, that the night was far from over. For the last guest at this dinner party, the one who had been a silent observer all along, had just revealed herself to be the most dangerous player of them all. The silence that followed Clara's confession was a living entity, a suffocating presence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, transforming the once opulent dining room into a grotesque tableau of shattered illusions. The other guests, who had been so consumed by their own guilt and fear, now stared at Clara with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They were no longer the main actors in this drama. They had been relegated to the role of a stunned, horrified audience. But it was Julian who was the most profoundly affected. The man who had been the architect of their shared nightmare, the self-appointed avenger of Marcus Thorne's memory, had been reduced to a hollowed-out shell of his former self. He stared at Clara, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The intricate tapestry of vengeance that he had so meticulously woven had been unraveled by a single, devastating thread of truth. He was not the puppet master. He had been a puppet all along, his strings pulled by the very woman he had brought to the manor to be a silent, unassuming witness. Clara, for her part, seemed to be transformed by her confession. The mousy, terrified woman who had been a ghost at the feast was gone. In her place was a woman who was eerily, terrifyingly calm. Her eyes, which had been downcast and fearful all evening, now held a chillingly resolute gleam. She had shed her disguise, and the creature that had been revealed was far more dangerous than anyone could have ever imagined. "You see," she said, her voice no longer a timid whisper but a clear, steady instrument of a newfound power. "You all thought you were so clever, so important, but you were just tools, my tools." She turned her gaze to Abernathy, a pitying smile playing on her lips. "You, with your insatiable greed. It was so easy to manipulate you. A few well-placed rumors about Marcus's reckless spending, a few anonymous tips about a golden opportunity, and you were putty in my hands." She then turned to Davies, her smile turning into a sneer. "And you, with your pathetic ambition. You were so desperate to climb the political ladder that you were willing to bury anyone who stood in your way. All it took was a little nudge in the right direction. A few whispers about the potential scandal if Marcus's unethical business practices were to come to light." Her eyes then fell upon Beatrice, a flicker of genuine contempt in their depths. "You were the easiest of all, so consumed by your own vanity, so desperate for adoration. All I had to do was plant the seeds of doubt in your mind, to make you believe that Marcus was more interested in his work than in you. You were so eager to believe the worst of him that you practically did my work for me." Finally, she turned to Liam, her voice softening, but with a predatory edge that was more chilling than any overt threat. "And you, my poor, misguided little artist. You were so hungry for recognition, so desperate to escape from Marcus's shadow. I knew that your talent was matched only by your insecurity. You were a masterpiece of manipulation, my finest creation." As she spoke, a sickening realization dawned on Eleanor. Clara had not just been a passive observer. She had been the architect of Marcus Thorne's destruction. She had been the one who had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, her motives not of greed or ambition, but of a twisted, possessive love that had curdled into a deadly obsession. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. "But why?" Eleanor asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "If you loved him, why would you destroy him?" Clara's chillingly calm facade finally cracked, revealing a flash of raw, unadulterated rage. "Because he wouldn't see me," she shrieked, her voice a raw, agonizing cry. "I was always there, in the shadows, his loyal, devoted assistant. I gave him everything, my heart, my soul, my body. But he was blind. He was so consumed by his work, by his ambition, by his friendship with him." Her accusing finger shot out, pointing at Julian, who flinched as if he had been struck. "He was the one who stood in my way," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "He was the one who had Marcus's heart, his trust, his loyalty. I had to get rid of him, and if that meant destroying Marcus in the process, then so be it." The full, horrifying truth of her plan was finally revealed. She had not just wanted to destroy Julian. She had wanted to make him suffer, to make him believe that he was responsible for his friend's downfall. She had wanted him to be consumed by the same guilt and despair that had driven Marcus to his death. And for years, her plan had worked perfectly. Julian had disappeared, a broken man haunted by the ghost of a betrayal that had not even been his own. But then he had resurfaced. He had begun his own investigation, his own quest for vengeance. And in doing so, he had unwittingly played right into her hands. He had gathered all the players in her twisted drama together, had set the stage for her final, triumphant act. And now, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, it's time for the grand finale. With a swift, sudden movement, she reached into her handbag and produced a small silver pistol. The gasp that went through the room was a single, collective intake of breath. The psychological warfare had just escalated into a deadly, life-or-death confrontation. Clara, no, Julian pleaded, his voice a broken, desperate plea. This is not the answer. Oh, but it is, she said, a beatific smile on her face. It's the only answer. A final, perfect ending to our tragic little story. She raised the pistol, her hand surprisingly steady. But she was not aiming at Julian. She was aiming at Eleanor. You, she said, her voice laced with a cold, dispassionate fury. You're the one who figured it out. The one who saw through my little performance. You're a loose end. And I don't like loose ends. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She stared down the barrel of the gun, the small, dark circle a portal to oblivion. In that moment, she was not afraid. She was angry. Angry at the sheer, senseless waste of it all. Angry at the lives that had been destroyed by this woman's twisted obsession. But before she could speak, before she could even think, a blur of movement caught her eye. Liam, the brooding, silent artist, had leaped from his chair, his body a shield between Eleanor and the gun. No, he screamed, his voice a raw, guttural cry of defiance. The gun went off, the sound a deafening explosion in the enclosed space. A single, perfect rose of red bloomed on Liam's chest. He staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Abernathy and Davies, in a moment of pure, unadulterated cowardice, scrambled to hide under the table. Beatrice let out a series of high-pitched, hysterical screams. But Eleanor's eyes were fixed on Liam. She rushed to his side, her hands pressing against the wound, a futile attempt to stem the tide of his lifeblood. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her, a faint, sad smile on his lips. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice a faint, gurgling sound. For everything. And then he was gone. The shock of Liam's death seemed to break the spell that had held them all captive. Julian, who had been frozen in a state of catatonic despair, suddenly sprang into action. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he lunged at Clara, his hands outstretched. But he was too late. Clara, her face a mask of triumphant madness, had already turned the gun on herself. The second shot was just as loud, just as final as the first. She crumpled to the floor, a still, silent figure in the growing pool of her own blood. The silence that followed was a silence of a different kind. It was not the silence of fear or suspicion. It was the silence of death. The silence of an ending that was as brutal as it was tragic. The hours that followed were a blur of flashing blue lights, of uniformed police officers, of hushed, urgent voices. Eleanor, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket, gave her statement, her voice a monotone, her emotions a frozen, numb landscape. She watched as the bodies of Liam and Clara were carried out on stretchers, their faces covered by white sheets. She saw Abernathy and Davies, their faces pale and drawn, being led away in handcuffs. And she saw Julian, a broken, empty man, being gently guided into the back of an ambulance, his eyes vacant, his spirit shattered. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, watery light on the scene of the carnage, a police officer approached her. He was a kind-faced man, his eyes filled with a weary sympathy. "We found this on the mantelpiece," he said, holding out the small, ornate key. "We believe it opens the front door." Eleanor took the key, its metal cool against her skin. It was a symbol of her freedom, a tangible reminder that her ordeal was finally over. But as she walked out of Blackwood Manor, leaving the ghosts of the dinner party behind, she knew that she would never be truly free. The memory of that night, of the last guest and the dinner that had ended in a deafening, eternal silence, would be a part of her forever. She had been a witness to the darkest corners of the human heart, and it was a knowledge that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The silence had been broken, but its echo would linger, a constant, chilling reminder of the night she had been an unwilling guest at a feast of death.